Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 33 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Pittsburgh Penguins and won by a score of 6-5 in overtime in what was one of the most incredible regular season games we have ever seen the San Jose Sharks play. Now, that's not to say that it was the cleanest or the most straightforward, and it certainly wasn't the best 60 minutes that they have ever had, but the excitement level was through the roof because of this crazy comeback the Sharks somehow managed to pull off in the final 3 quarters of this third period, ending out with that overtime game winner as the cherry on top. Now, before we get into the details of how this game ended, we do have to start where it began. This was the 5th and final game of a 5-game road trip for the San Jose Sharks, and you're always wondering what type of performance you're going to get. Is there going to be a certain sense of fatigue because of all the travel that the Sharks have done over these last few days, or is it going to be a moment to empty the tank because they have 2 more days off before their next game back in San Jose on Tuesday? And at first, it looked like an empty the tank type of situation. The Sharks in the first period were actually pretty good, especially 5-on-5. They would score the only 5-on-5 goal of this opening frame. That one comes from Tyler Toffoli, a shot from very far out, somehow manages to beat Shilov's, and it is 1-0 Sharks. However, where the Penguins are able to do their damage in this first period is basically what they have been relying on all year to carry them to the amount of success that they have had, which is their power play. Coming into tonight, they had the 3rd best power play in the entire NHL, over 30%, and we saw exactly why that was in this game. So efficient, so smooth, incredible puck movement. In contrast, the Sharks' power play looks nothing like this, and the Penguins score their first of 3 power play goals as Sidney Crosby gets it past Askarov to make it 1-1 between these teams by the end of 20 minutes. Now, you're hopeful that the Sharks will be able to still carry some momentum into that second period because, again, they really didn't play all that badly in the first. As long as they stay out of the box, they had a good chance of winning this game. But this middle frame was one of the worst periods the Sharks have played all season long. They looked completely disorganized, in particular right in front of their goaltender, could not cover anybody. And so the Penguins get goals from McGroarty, they get goals from Hayes, and from Brian Rust, another power play goal there to make it 4-1 Penguins after 40 minutes. And honestly, it could have been like 6-1 if not for Askarov, because the Penguins were just pelting the Sharks with shots and chances, over 20 shots against in this second period. And the thing is that things didn't immediately get better from there in the third. The Sharks get an early power play here, but what ends up happening is that Will Smith along the boards, he reaches for a puck, puts himself in a vulnerable position, and Wotherspoon finishes his check. There's nothing suspension worthy in this situation, just an unfortunate spot there. And with Smith immediately heading down to the bench, straight to the dressing room, the Sharks, they respond to one of their top players going down. Eklund jumps in there, Celebrini jumps in there, and Celebrini ends up getting hit for a 4-minute minor for roughing. Wotherspoon gets 2 of his own, but that means we go to 4-on-4, and when that 4-on-4 expires, the Penguins get another about 30 seconds of power play ice time, and really that's all they need, as I spoke about their efficiency here, and it is Mantha who finds the 3rd power play goal of the night. That makes it 5-1 with only about 15 minutes to go in this entire game, and so in this point you're thinking, this one's done. There's no way that the Sharks are going to be able to make that 4-goal comeback, especially since Smith just went down for an injury. And back in the second period, so did Kurashev. 2/3 of the Sharks' top line here tonight did not even manage to finish this game. However, the Sharks end up getting gifted an opportunity pretty soon after this Mantha goal goes in, because right after this opening draw, pretty much, the Sharks get another power play, and then it is former San Jose Shark Erik Karlsson who ends up playing the puck, or attempting to play the puck, with a broken stick, which is a penalty. He had no idea his stick was broken in this situation, and so the Sharks end up on a 5-on-3. The thing was, however, is that Celebrini couldn't even participate in this 5-on-3 because he was still in the box because of that 4-minute roughing penalty. That's how quick of a turnaround this was, and yet still, John Klingberg, just as he has been doing these last few games, he gets the job done offensively, scores this goal, and gets the Sharks to within 3. Still, a pretty deep deficit for them, and when you take a look at the couple goals that they did score at that moment, the Toffoli goal from very far out, a low percentage shot, and the Klingberg goal 5-on-3, these aren't necessarily the most replicable type of situations. But the Sharks, they do not give in, they do not give up. It is Eklund who finds a goal responds to the traffic in front. The puck is just sitting there. Eklund zooms in and manages to get it past Shilovs. That makes it 5-3. And then we end up heading to where the Sharks have to pull their goaltender. And it looked as though the Penguins were going to get the chance to put this game away. Sidney Crosby feeds it to Brian Rust in the neutral zone. He's pretty much at the red line here. He takes this shot and it somehow ends up just barely missing the net. It hits the post and the Sharks survive, and they are able to capitalize on that and get it going the other way. Celebrini scores pretty soon after on a one-timer to make it 5-4, and then it is Tyler Toffoli with the game-tying goal, coming all the way back from down 5-1 just a few minutes earlier to now having a 5-5 game heading into the post-regulation play. In that overtime, the Sharks decide to once again, just as they did 2 nights ago against the Leafs, start with a setup of Wenberg and Celebrini up front with John Klingberg on the blue line, and it takes a few minutes, or it takes about a minute to actually get going. Celebrini gets caught on the ice for a long while, but he stays out there and really doesn't actually sit for all that long. And eventually, we have John Klingberg, who makes an absolutely incredible move. And not only does he make a nice move, he does it on Sidney Crosby, of all players. One of the best players in the league, has been one of the best players in the league for the last 20 years. Klingberg makes him look silly, feeds the puck to Celebrini, who is still on the ice, who then gets it back to Klingberg for this game winner, for this victory for the San Jose Sharks. As I said, just an absolutely incredible win for this Sharks team. This is a momentum building type of win, and I'm really interested to see where the Sharks end up going from here, because this is the type of comeback that can honestly not just turn a game around, but turn a season around. Not as though that the Sharks have been playing all that terribly results-wise as of late, but they've had some struggles in many games that they have had. Could this be a moment moving forward that shifts the fortunes of the San Jose Sharks? We shall see, but at the very least, this particular game in a vacuum was insane to watch. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line. It is Kurashev, Smith, and Celebrini, though by the end of the night it was just Celebrini due to the 2 injuries. But let us start off with number 71, who had just an incredible night. If you needed further evidence for why Macklin Celebrini is the future captain of this team, and honestly the kind of pseudo-captain of this team currently, you don't have to look any further than the game here tonight. Celebrini ends up with over 27 minutes of ice time, just an absurd amount for a forward to be hitting in any game, never mind a regular season game. And we see in the overtime just how much the Sharks believe in him. He begins the overtime on the ice for this shift. He plays the next 90 seconds, and already a 90-second shift 5-on-5 is tough. 3-on-3 with the more ice that you have to cover is even tougher. He heads to the bench after that. He sits on the bench for just 25 seconds before coming right back out, playing another minute, and then having the primary assist on this John Klingberg overtime game winner. And of course, we cannot also discount the contributions that he made in helping the Sharks tie this one up, getting the goal that makes it 5-4, and then the secondary assist, although he was the one who originally takes the shot on this game tying goal as well. A 3-point night for him. But the thing is that it's not as though the first 55 minutes of this game was so bad and then he somehow comes back with 3 points. He was very good. In fact, probably the Sharks' best player in the first period. He was still actually pretty solid in the second, despite the struggles that the Sharks were having, and he was continuing to push early parts of the third as well. He absolutely deserved the 3 points that he put on tonight. He was the best player, at least best forward, I should say, for the San Jose Sharks in this game. Just continues to just be that incredibly clutch player that the Sharks need. I can't even necessarily call him a future superstar, because honestly, 19 years old, he is already a superstar in this league. Now 47 points, that is second in the entire NHL, a few behind Nathan MacKinnon for that top spot. But the thing is, and this is not to take anything away from MacKinnon, he gets to play on the best team in the NHL. He's playing consistently with Martin Necas, who is a fantastic offensive player as well. And then not to mention the fact that on the blue line, he's got the best defenseman in the entire league, Cale Makar. That is a very favorable situation for being able to put up points, and that is not even to mention some of the other great talent that the Avalanche also have. The Sharks, that's not a similar situation here for Macklin Celebrini. He has, of course, Will Smith, but on the blue line, it's a bunch of scrap players who are just trying to be kind of plucky and redeeming themselves and having a big year, and there's not much depth scoring, and so the other teams can really just key in onto Celebrini. And the fact that he is able to put up the production that he has been this year, again as a teenager in the NHL, is just absolutely incredible, and this was an all-timer game from him. When it comes to his two line mates, Smith, I also had thought started out this game rather well. He and Celebrini were showcasing tremendous chemistry in that first period. The fact that they didn't manage to score a goal was the most surprising part of the first 20 minutes. As well, in the second period, kind of like Celebrini, he wasn't great or anything, but he was still pretty decent and one of the Sharks' better players. But then he goes down with that injury, and you can see just how much a player like Smith means for this team, that they were able to rally around that. I can, of course, draw the comparison to the 2019 playoffs when it was Joe Pavelski who went down with an injury. That one looked obviously a little bit more kind of dangerous there, as Pavelski was down on the ice for a while and he's bleeding and all of that. But still, this is a key player, key offensive player for the San Jose Sharks, who goes down with an injury, and the team is able to get behind him and finish off a miraculous comeback. And so Smith, not only did he showcase his value on the ice, he showcases his clear value off the ice as well. And when it comes to his the final line mate here, Philip Kurashev, I was surprised-ish, not too happy to see him on this top line. I really feel as though the Sharks should give more of a look to Colin Graf in that particular spot, because I still feel as though the Celebrini-Smith-Graf line is the best that the first line has looked all season long, and Kurashev is kind of a known quantity in this position still. However, it did work out at the beginning. Now, to be fair, I will say that Celebrini and Smith, it didn't really matter who they would be playing with how good they looked in that first period. Anybody could have been in that lineup spot, but still Kurashev did a pretty decent job in that role. Unfortunate for him that he ends up going down with an injury at about the halfway mark here. If both him and Smith end up missing considerable time moving forward, which is certainly possible, that will be another massive hit to a San Jose Sharks offense that already didn't really have much going for it prior to this game. When it comes to the Sharks' second line now, here we had Wenberg, Toffoli, and Graf, and this was a big night for both Toffoli and Wenberg. I believe the two of them both had 4-point games. I had mentioned in the last one against the Toronto Maple Leafs, Toffoli didn't, I believe, end up pulling up a single point in that game, but he was having some really solid chances, and I was hopeful that those types of opportunities of getting into the middle of the ice, getting deeper and closer to the crease, would actually lead to further success in this season. And in the very next game, Toffoli is able to show up with an important night here. He comes up huge for the San Jose Sharks. He gets that game-tying goal. He gets that first goal, which was, to be fair, not exactly a skilled one necessarily, because the Pittsburgh Penguins goaltender completely blew it. Like, that should not be a goal that ever actually goes in, but he still comes up huge near the end of that third period. And so Toffoli, this was not like a perfect game from him. I thought he was kind of bad in that second period, but he comes up in the end for the San Jose Sharks, and that's really all that matters here. When it comes to his line mate, Alex Wenberg, he is coming off of a 3-point night to the other game against the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he just continues to pile up the points in this one. I will still stick to the idea that he's not much of a second-line center, but this is still a player who can do so much work for the San Jose Sharks, and he can be that type of extremely important player nonetheless. And you wonder now, as you angle towards the trade deadline in just about 3 or less than 3 months' time, whether or not Alex Wenberg will either be retained by the San Jose Sharks or if he'll end up being a bit of a hot commodity on the trade market. We saw in particular last season that even centermen who were actually not all that great, like a guy like Scott Lawton, for instance, of the Philadelphia Flyers, still managed to command a pretty hefty price at the deadline as teams were desperately searching for some center depth. Wenberg could provide tremendous center depth with the ability to be either an elite third-line center or at least a somewhat serviceable second-line center, especially if you give him two really good offensive players. And so we'll see what the Sharks end up doing with him. I certainly wouldn't be opposed with holding on to Alex Wenberg. I think he can be a key player even past this season if the Sharks would be able to re-sign him, but it is going to depend on exactly where the Sharks find themselves in the standings by the time that deadline does roll around. There is still a good amount of time for a lot to change on that front. When it comes to Colin Graf, obviously a rough night for the penalty kill in general, as they end up giving up 3 goals here. The Penguins' power play was just fantastic, and they just decimated the Sharks' penalty killing setup. Now, I wouldn't really necessarily put that fully onto Colin Graf, but since in the previous games I've given him credit when the Sharks have been perfect on the penalty kill, you do have to take a little bit of away when the Sharks are far from perfect in that same type of situation. But at even strength, I thought Graf did some very good work. He ends up picking up a couple of assists there, a key shift on that overtime overtime as well, the secondary assist on that one. And so it ended up being an alright game for Colin Graf, who hits over 19 minutes in this one. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, here we have Skinner, Dellandrea, and Eklund. Eklund does show why he is still the third best offensive player on this team in those final few minutes. Still a guy that, despite being demoted down to a third line for this particular game, is still a go-to in the 6-on-5, is still a go-to in tight situations here, and he is able to come up with some of those key moments. That third goal, probably one of the more important, if not the most important one of the entire game. As I had said, that the Foley goal early on was not really a replicable situation, low percentage shot, and then the Klingberg goal is that 5-on-3. The Sharks needed a 5-on-5 goal to show that they can actually beat Shilovs in a normal type of spot, and that's what Eklund was able to come through with, and so credit to him in that situation. When it comes to his two line mates, Dellandrea didn't really play much of a role in this game. The Sharks heavily leaned on their offensive guys near the end that they knew could provide something, since Kurashev and Smith were both out. So we saw a lot of Celebrini, a lot of Wenberg and Graf and Toffoli and Eklund. Not a ton of some of these other players. Skinner we also saw a decent amount of. But Dellandrea, Gaudette, Reeves, Goodrow all ended up with pretty low amounts of ice time. Dellandrea a little bit higher than the others, but it's not as though he necessarily managed to provide much. And then when it comes to Jeff Skinner, he got a good opportunity early on. He was actually promoted to that top line after Kurashev had gone down, but before Smith had gone down. It was Skinner with Celebrini and Smith, and then it actually ended up still being Skinner with Celebrini and Graf after the Smith injury. He also drew that original penalty early on into the third period, and so you could give him some credit there with a nice move that he ended up making. And so Skinner, I thought, had a pretty good game. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, this was a group of players that had to kind of take a back seat to the offense that the Sharks were looking for in that third period, and so Reeves didn't play much. Goodrow, even despite the 6 power plays that the Penguins got, he didn't play all that much either. And even Gaudette, I thought maybe he would have had a little bit more ice time. Not quite the case, and it honestly wasn't that great of a game for this fourth line either in general, and so not too upset that they didn't really get much opportunity there in the end. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, two notable things to mention, as it is two players who drop out of the lineup. No Shakir Mukhamadullin tonight, but before we pick up the pitchforks, it should be noted that Mukhamadullin was injured for this game, so he's not being healthy scratched. That would have been absurd after probably what was his best game of the entire year against the Toronto Maple Leafs 2 nights ago. It is just extremely unfortunate that he's not able to build on that game because of this injury. Hopefully it is not too long term. And then it is Timothy Liljegren, who also gets taken out of the lineup. Now, as far as I am concerned, I think this was a healthy scratch. Maybe he's banged up, maybe there's an injury, but it feels as though from what I saw, this was a healthy scratch, and it is Nick Leddy who ends up taking his spot in the lineup. Sort of, I guess. Maybe you could argue it is Iorio, but I'm choosing to believe that it is Nick Leddy because this ends up being a really terrible choice, though I'll get to that a little bit later. When it comes to the Sharks' top pairing, however, here we have Orlov and the one and only, the GOAT, the greatest of all time, John Klingberg on the blue line, future Norris winner this season, as Klingberg comes through in the clutch for the San Jose Sharks yet again. He has been the team's best defenseman in 3 of the last 4 games. That game against the Philadelphia Flyers was quite bad, so that is a good reminder that over the next couple of months, we'll probably still get a few stinker games here or there from John Klingberg where he looks just generally quite poor. But you go back to the game against Carolina, he was very good there. You go back a couple of nights ago against Toronto, he was very good there, and you look at tonight against the Pittsburgh Penguins, he was again very good. And the thing is that it's not just the offense that he is able to push through in this final third period here, and that overtime game winner with the crazy move that he made around Sidney Crosby. Even by the end of the second period, I had actually tweeted out that Klingberg was on his way to being the best defenseman of the night for the San Jose Sharks, because despite the struggles shown by almost every single other player on the defensive side in that middle frame, Klingberg was the only one who still actually looked pretty good in that second period, which surprised me more than pretty much anybody. Like, that was crazy to see that Klingberg actually maintained decent defensive form in a second period where the Sharks just looked completely disorganized. And so this has been an incredible stretch of games for John Klingberg thus far. Now, do the 3 really good games negate the 20 terrible ones of the earlier parts of the season? Not quite just yet, but as I have mentioned time and time again, this is a league that you say, what have you done for me lately? lately, and lately John Klingberg has been incredibly clutch for this San Jose Sharks roster. If you had asked me a week ago whether or not I thought John Klingberg could be moved at the deadline, I would have said maybe as like defensive depth, a team would trade like a 5th round pick in return from Klingberg. But now, after watching him this past week, there is the possibility that if he continues to build on this, that not only could he be movable at that deadline, but he might even end up being a little bit of a hot commodity. A right-shot defenseman who can provide some offense, and just last season was actually at least relatively solid with the Edmonton Oilers during their Stanley Cup Finals run, even in a sheltered role. That could be a rather attractive option for a desperate team looking for some help. And with the entire league really gearing up for a strong playoff run this season, you take a look at the Colorado Avalanche, how dangerous they look, the Dallas Stars, how dangerous they look, the Minnesota Wild having just traded a lot of futures players to grab Quinn Hughes, one of the best, if not the best defenseman in the entire NHL. Teams are definitely going to be looking to level up at that trade deadline, and Klingberg, again, if he continues to play like this, and there's no guarantee that he does, he could be a really interesting option for a team to pick up, and that is just something that the Sharks have been praying and crossing their fingers for a while, and it's finally beginning to pay dividends. When it comes to his defensive partner, Dmitry Orlov, this is actually one of those strange games where I feel as though Orlov was actually kind of carried a little bit by John Klingberg. Orlov made a lot of mistakes in this middle frame. He started the game out well, he ended the game well, but in the second period, probably good 3 or 4 big individual errors of just giving the puck away in his own zone that did not look really good whatsoever. But Klingberg, I won't say he bailed him out necessarily, but he managed to maintain a certain sense of decorum there in that in his defensive zone, and that certainly helped out. And so this first pairing ends up being the best of the night for the Sharks. When it comes to the second period, we go from the Sharks' best defenseman of the night to the Sharks' worst, as lost in this ocean of excitement after this crazy comeback, the silent but deadly Nick Leddy lurks in the abyss of negativity, because Nick Leddy was very bad in this game. He was on the ice for every single one of these Pittsburgh goals against, not a single exception to that. Every single one, all 5 goals, Leddy was not only on the ice for, but he was within a few feet of the eventual goal scorer. You can't necessarily pin them all on Leddy, but he at least played somewhat of a part in every single one of these goals actually going in. And I have asked the question before of why Nick Leddy continues to get these games, and I will continue to ask this question. This is a player who should just not even be in the NHL with the San Jose Sharks anymore, who should not even be in the lineup. And it's one thing if Liljegren was actually injured, because then you don't actually have a better choice, and so, or you don't actually have any other choice unless you called somebody up, and so Leddy kind of has to be there. But if this was a situation where Liljegren ended up being a healthy scratch, that doesn't seem like the right choice, because Liljegren, as much of a struggle as he has had over these last couple of weeks in many of his games, even he is not going to be as bad as Nick Leddy, and I've kind of stuck by this the entire season long. You know, when it comes to John Klingberg, obviously much was said about the struggles that he was having back at the beginning of the season, but I have always been adamant of the fact that Klingberg at the very least was still above Nick Leddy in the depth charts, because if Klingberg could find a way to get things together and for his game to click, he would provide something that the Sharks do not have much of, which is a good puck mover at the blue line. The thing was with Nick Leddy is that even if everything comes together for him, and even if he does have this resurgence, the best that the Sharks will end up getting out of Nick Leddy is a good third pairing defenseman, and that is the last thing they need. They already have a bunch of basically third pairing defensemen on this team. They don't need another one in Nick Leddy, and so Klingberg has shown that upside. Even if Leddy eventually gets to that point, it's still not even an exciting notion, and so this is still a player who should not be playing and was a huge liability for this team throughout this entire game. And then when it comes to Mario Ferraro, he was simply dragged down by Nick Leddy's performance. I really don't think Mario Ferraro was all that bad, but Leddy ends up making him look quite bad with all the goals that Ferraro also ended up getting caught on the ice for too. Now, on the penalty kill side, I do think Ferraro had some major issues here, so it's not as though that he was fantastic, but 5-on-5, I thought he did some decent work. But like I said with Colin Graff, if you're crediting the penalty kill for when they come out huge, you gotta fault the penalty kill when they give up a bunch of goals, which was the case here tonight, and it was Ferraro and Leddy kind of at the forefront of that, but it did feel as though Leddy was the much greater issue. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing here, we have Sam Dickinson and Vincent Iorio. Both of these players had some kind of up and down performances. Now, Dickinson, I was looking for a bit of a bounce back because the other night against Toronto in that little homecoming game for himself back in Toronto for the first time in his career, he looked a little bit jumpy, a little bit unsure, and just a little bit maybe over-eager. I guess you could describe it that way. Defensively, he had some issues. Here tonight, I think he settled down at least a little bit. It was still not a great game for Sam Dickinson, who definitely made a couple of defensive errors, but I do like the fact that he was jumping up into the play. I do like the fact that he actually looked pretty good and effective offensively. Plus, he picks up that primary assist on the Tyler Toffoli goal. Not an incredible primary assist by any stretch of the imagination, but still, Dickinson was all right. I also felt as though Iorio also had a little bit of that kind of issue defensively too. He had some problems within his own zone. Neither were as bad as Nick Leddy, certainly not managing to hit those levels, but you would look for a little bit of improvement there. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender Yaroslav Askarov. So this is kind of, you could say, similar in the way that it was to the Minnesota Wild game from about a couple of months ago at this point when the Sharks also won 6-5 in overtime, though in very different fashion, because this was a game in which Askarov, yes, he gives up 5 goals, but you can't really argue that he played all that poorly. The Penguins gave him a ton of shots on net. It gave a ton of scoring chances on net at both 5-on-5, at least in that second period, but in particular 5-on-4. Askarov had to make a ton of really great saves for the Sharks to keep them alive in that middle frame when San Jose just weren't even showing up to actually play, and in the end, he manages to get that job done. You take a look at all of these goals he gives up. The only one that maybe he could have had back was the McGroarty goal. That one beats him over the blocker side top corner, but even that was like an incredible shot. But the Crosby goal is a scramble in front. You look at the Mantha goal, doesn't have much of a chance. The Hayes goal doesn't have much of a chance. So Askarov did his job, did his part. He didn't necessarily steal a game, obviously, for the San Jose Sharks, but he was far from a problem here. It was the defense that completely let him down, but in the end, it all comes back and the Sharks get the win. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will finally be heading back home for the game on Tuesday. It was a 5-game road trip that in the end actually ended up being positive for San Jose. 3-2 record, a total of 6 of a possible 10 points claimed. This was a pretty important road trip. It was the type of road trip that would be somewhat of a measuring stick for the San Jose Sharks. They wouldn't necessarily be playing the best of the best teams, although they started out with Dallas and Carolina, but it was some playoff squads, and if the Sharks had gone, 4-1, or as we see 3-2, there was a reason to have hope moving forward, and on the other hand, if the Sharks had gone 1-4, well, maybe you would give up on any sort of playoff opportunities, but especially with a victory like this, that could give so much confidence moving forward, this is still an interesting team to watch here as we get closer and closer to the Christmas break, which is not something I thought I would be saying back at the beginning of the year. Class dismissed.